Alan Laurita, this is fabulous. What a bonus. What a bonus. Were you destined to be a lawyer? Was this something in your family where there's some history?
No. My parents were strict working class. My dad was a, pardon me, a bus dispatcher, which is something they don't do anymore, but he basically used to stand on a street corner in Queens and direct, for the transit authority, bus traffic.
Ah.
My mom worked in a department store, and later in life in a factory where they did telecommunications stuff. A lawyer was something I decided I was going to be before I really knew what a lawyer was. And for some foolish reason, stuck with it the rest of my life.
Queens, so that's, you were born there?
I was born in Flushing, New York, which is in Queens, and then grew up in Nassau County, a town or a village, not even a village actually, called Hicksville, which is probably most famous for a guy who was a couple of years younger than me. Billy Joel came from Hicksville, and a lot of the songs bring back memories from Hicksville. But that's where I grew up, which is about as far removed from Chautauqua County as you can be in a lot of ways.
So, were you, being in Flushing, were you a New York Mets guy?
The Mets came into existence long after I had an affiliation. In fact, I was at the second or third games the Mets ever won. But they started in '62, and by then I was a sophomore in high school. Kind of, when I was growing up, baseball was the big sport, and it was almost, I looked at it as kind of a rite of passage as when you were in grade school, elementary school, of choosing between one of the three local teams, the Yankees, Dodgers, and Giants, because the Dodgers and Giants were still New York City teams until '58. So no, I was a diehard New York Yankee fan, still am. My big hero when I was a kid was Mickey Mantle.
Sure. And you probably wore number 7 playing Little League.
Well, they assigned whatever numbers you got. And I don't think I ever got to wear number 7.
That was always the big one. Everybody wanted 7.
Yeah,
number 7. That's great. So you find yourself and you graduate from high school what year?
I graduated in '64.
64 from?
Hicksville High School.
Hicksville High School. And did you know what then, college-wise, was there some sort of encouragement where you might go?
I wanted to stay in the state, and I had, through guidance counselor and that, gotten some direction. I looked at Hobart, Albany, and Buffalo, and I had dreams I was going to play football. And Buffalo was at that time a Division I school, and the others, Hobart was Division III, and Albany didn't have a team. And that was a large factor in where I decided to go. Of course, my football career only lasted a year, but...
You went to Buffalo?
Yeah,
okay.
And went there for 4 years, graduated in 4 years.
So just out of curiosity, when you're talking Hobart, I was being recruited at Hobart as well, and there was a Coach Kelly. Was he there at the time? Does that ring any bells at all?
It does.
Ira Kelly or something like that?
It does not. I mean, the big coach from my college era was UB's defensive coordinator, a guy named Buddy Ryan.
Yeah.
Who became even more famous later.
Exactly. So you go to UB, you go to UB College. Did you decide then, what point was the aha moment regarding going to law school?
When I was a young kid. That's what I was going to do. And I didn't deviate from that, and I just planned on going to law school. And so that was, my plan for when I graduated. And graduated, applied to a couple of different schools, including UB, and was accepted there. I was fortunate. I had good LSAT scores, and like my undergraduate career, had a full scholarship to both academic scholarships to college and law school. So that was very helpful.
Terrific. So you go to UB Law School and graduate, pass the bar, then where?
Well, that was a time where it was hard to find law jobs. Up until I was a senior in college, this was an era of the Vietnam War. Law school was a deferment. So their law schools were packed and graduating classes were packed. Unfortunately, the deferment ended when I started law school, and my law school career was interrupted by 2 years in the Army.
Okay.
But was able to find a job in Buffalo with what I'll call a mid-sized firm, 12 attorneys, called Williams, Volgino, and Tisdale in Buffalo. And I quickly began to learn what lawyers did and what this lawyer was going to do, and quickly became unhappy with what I was doing with that firm.
What kind of practice was it?
Half the firm did workman's compensation, and the other half were general practitioners. I did a lot of their real estate, a little bit of estate work, whatever I was told to do by the partners. I got slotted in with the non-workman's comp people, which was great, but like I said, I wasn't that excited about it, and I had become very close friends with Jim Donovan, and our wives, we were both married, me before senior in law school. Jim had been married before that, I'm not sure how much longer, had become best friends. And Jim had come down here to practice in Mayville and saw lots of opportunity, and talked me into coming down to Mayville to practice. So I did that in November of 1974.
Jim had already been here.
Jim had come down after graduation, which was 73.
Was he by himself, or did he affiliate with somebody?
He came down to work with Gene DeMambro, who was an attorney, but not really a practicing attorney, but liked the idea of having his name on a law firm. And a great guy, good mentor in terms of a lot of business things, not really doing any legal work or practicing any legal work or teaching us anything about legal work. It was truthfully, if you look back on it, pretty scary, because it was Jim and I, a year out of law school, teaching ourselves how to practice law and run a business and build a business. And amazingly, it worked out pretty well.
Was there niches as you were trying to build up a practice, because you're not from the area? Jim, I don't think was from here. Is it?
Jim was from Brockport. The niches were really what we turned out we liked to do, and it was a great match. I really enjoyed doing real estate, some corporate work, what I looked at as helping people. Jim loved doing criminal work, matrimonial work, both of which I hated to do. I think I've done one criminal trial in my life. When I first came down here, and truthfully, Jim had done a marvelous job working it up, and it involved a boating accident on Finley Lake where a young girl had been killed, and we were defending the young man who was operating the other boat, and Jim had found witnesses and everything, but as we drove to the trial, we didn't have a plan as to who was going to try the case, who was going to get up, and I started, and it worked out well, so I just kept on going. But that was the end of my criminal law experience, thank goodness.
That was here in Chautauqua County Court?
That was here in Chautauqua County in the town of Mina. In fact, John Ward, who you mentioned earlier, was the DA at the time. He was assistant DA, but he tried the case. And sheriff's department officer who had investigated it was Ernie Cowan,
Yeah.
who you might remember Ernie from the Sea Lion Project, who ultimately, a couple of years later, I wound up forming for Ernie, and started, that project out, which was interesting.
Well, there you go. Everybody remembers kind of who were especially transactional people like you and me. You always had that dabble in the criminal law, whether it was an assigned counsel or had a kind of a one-off or two-off, and you do remember all of that.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
it is how some of those things stick with you. But yeah, I mean that was my one venture into it. I'm glad I didn't do any more. Unfortunately, or fortunately, in our division of labor, I wound up doing the civil litigation and really didn't enjoy that either. But wound up doing it because it was necessary to do, and that helped. But really, my practice or my part of the practice was built up around real estate, and it was primarily servicing clients. We got a lot of referrals from where we were, people from outside the area or people moving into the area. And the realtors liked the fact that I got things closed when the contract said they were going to close, kept the fees reasonable, and was always available to talk to the clients and things like that. And when you provided good service, they gave you more referrals. And there were a couple real estate firms that started out during that era, and they kind of grew, and we grew with them and kept getting referrals. And even reluctantly, the long-established realtor in the area, a gentleman by the name of John Bertram, who had a distinct dislike for Gene DeMambro and wouldn't send any business to our firm, turned around after an incident where one of his clients had a tight window on a closing, and I was representing the other side on a referral, and the attorney representing his client wasn't doing much, and I wound up getting it done. And the next thing I knew, John was there with a bottle of whiskey as a Christmas present, and by the way, can you do work on my house? So that grew well, and I was really happy with the way that turned out.
DeMambro, Donovan, and Laurita. So tell me a little bit more about Gene. I too, our paths crossed, but it was always on a real estate deal. Or he was a developer, or he was entitled to something.
Gene was quite a bit older than we were. I mean, at the time I was thinking he was an old man because he's my age now. But had come from Detroit to the area, owned a couple businesses in town, Standard Portable Products being the most notable, but Mayville Wire Forms was involved in Jamestown Plastics, so a lot of local businesses. Developed Chautauqua Shores subdivision, owned a lot of apartments. He was a businessman, and he was very good at it. And he worked hard. One of the lessons I learned from Gene in all of his business dealings, he always came away saying, I want to make a deal with people where everybody benefits. Because I can really beat somebody up in a business deal, but then they'll never want to do business with me again. But if everybody benefits, I've got somebody who's going to come back to me time and again. And he was a good mentor in that respect. He wasn't a practicing lawyer. I don't think he ever did any legal work at the firm. But that was fine. He was, supportive. He owned the building we were practicing in, and then sold it to us on very generous terms. So it worked out well.
And Jim's practice, you mentioned he'd like to be in the criminal world, divorce world, sort of that litigation aspect of it.
Right.
Tell me a little bit more about him.
Jim is my age, or actually slightly younger. His wife at the time, Ann Donovan at the time, Ann Luce now, her family came from the area. Well, her family at the time, where she grew up in Brockport, and her dad was a professor at Brockport. Her grandparents and that were from the area. So she was familiar. They had a property on the lake. So that's how they first became familiar with the area. Jim came down here because, like I said, it was an era that was difficult to find jobs. And he had seen an opportunity down here, grew the business. Jim still is very outgoing and personable, and was able to develop real good relationships. And that was very helpful. He managed to get a role as a public defender, and honed his skills that way. Through Gene DeMambro, we had a guy who was a year behind us start working for the firm. Actually, he was doing work for the firm before I got there, Raleigh Kidder.
I forgot, yes.
And Raleigh's political contacts were very helpful to two young attorneys who were starting out and didn't mind getting government work. And Raleigh didn't actually work for us after he finally was admitted, but he worked for us for a couple of years while he was going to law school and getting ready. But then he kept going with his political career. But he was a friend and somebody we dealt with regularly, and that was helpful. And then we, say Jim was a good attorney, was good at what he did, enjoyed what he did, and it was a good match for the two of us because neither one of us were competing for the same work. I didn't want anything to do with what he did, and he didn't want anything to do with what I did, so it worked out well.
It did. Now, who was the public defender at the time when Jim was there?
Well, I don't remember who it was initially. Ed Fagan became the public defender. I don't remember who it was initially, but Ed came in. He was a native of Jamestown, had gone to school in Colorado and came back, and through his political connections was appointed public defender. And in fact, Lee Adams would harass Jim regularly about the fact that should have been his position, not Ed's, because Lee and Ed didn't get along too well at all.
Pretty well known.
Yeah.
Did Jim come back at times, because he's now in the office with Ed, and it's sort of well known and became somewhat public, but Judge Adams's disfavor, maybe that's not the correct term, but towards Ed, and it was a personality thing.
It was a personality thing. It was some of the things Ed did that were questionable, and Jim, to his credit, the type of guy he was, actually got what Ed, or convinced me that Ed should be of counsel to our firm. We helped him set up, and when he got in trouble with Lee, it was actually me who went over and talked to Lee Adams to keep Ed out of jail, which we, was reasonable about. Yeah. And we were fortunate. Lee liked both Jim and I, and it was, if Lee liked you and you were respectful and you did what you were supposed to do as an attorney, he was very helpful to you. And he was very helpful to both of us.
Yeah, my wife Cindy was a clerk for Judge Adams at the time.
Yep, Judge Adams and Bill Cass.
And Bill Cass, correct. Both of them, yeah.
And both of them, like I say, were very helpful to Jim and I. Starting out, they didn't do anything wrong, but I think they liked the fact that we were young attorneys in town trying to, start out and build a practice, and they gave what help they could to us in that regard.
Did you find yourself, because of your proximity and being young, and that you became assigned counsel for?
No, I don't think I've ever been assigned counsel.
Oh, shame on you, man.
Well, you know,
because Jim was doing it. I mean, they always wanted somebody from the firms to be available.
And you know, with Jim being public defender, of course, he was doing a lot of that work anyway. So I think it was pretty well recognized, or I think I made it pretty clear. I didn't want to be a litigator, so I stayed away from that stuff.
Did you have other people who worked in the office while it was, aside from Raleigh?
Oh, sure. Well, Ed Fagan for a while, Jerry Hyde, Jim Westman. Boy, who else was there? Jim Subject, before he became district attorney. Yeah, that was pretty much the crew. And,
Now those
Dusty Nelson as a clerk for a while.
And then before I went with Scheck and Whipple.
Yeah.
Or Brandloffen, I guess, at the time. Who were in West, or rather in Mayville, where your offices were, who were some of the other lawyers who had offices there at the time? There were some senior people at the time.
Brant Lachlan was the big fish in the sea in Mayville. Bart Shack was the resident lawyer, but as you probably recall, they had offices in Westfield where Bob Lachlan was, up in Fredonia. Ron Gibb had an office, although he worked a lot of the time, I believe, for public defender, and later I think he may have been an assistant district attorney. Those were the main ones. You know, as we were trying to build a practice, to the extent there was a big competitor, it was Brant and Lachlan, because they were, like I said, the big fish in the sea, and you know, they would get a lot of referrals, a lot of real estate practice, but it was friendly. Pete Clark worked for them. Pete Clark had graduated with Jim and I from law school, and we had a standing Monday coffee hour, because Pete would be in for a calendar call or something like that, and we'd get together every Monday for coffee.
If you could have only bring the guy out, he was so reserved, you know. Peter.
And I think Pete's still practicing. I run into him occasionally at the gas station.
Well, he is, and the greatest Toastmaster ever. The guy has such a quick sense of humor.
He has a unique sense of humor. But yeah, he's a good guy.
He's a good guy. I'm visualizing a senior lawyer, and I'm drawing a real blank. I mean, may have been even retired when you and I got started, but he had an office there in Mayville, the corner.
Oh, Seymour Rollman. I almost forgot. I don't know why. Seymour was right next door to us. And yeah, the Seymour was there, and for a long time. And I apologize for not thinking of him immediately, but yeah, he was right next to us.
Was he principally a land guy, an estates guy?
His practice at the time that I was there seemed mostly estates. He didn't, and he was the attorney for the town and the village, I believe. So he had, you know, a lot of municipal law stuff, or at least local municipal law stuff, and pretty good estate practice.
I think I see his name. That's how I remember, frankly, his name on the building. The Seymour Rollman building, or the Seymour Rollman Town Hall, or something like that.
Yeah, he was there for forever, and he was a local guy. Yeah, and quiet. He was very quiet, and also uncomfortable with litigation.
You practiced for how long privately? And before you kind of you had an additional client in the oil and gas business. There was a time when all of a sudden that started to burgeon.
There was. I came down here in '74. Had worked in Buffalo for a year before that, And January of '82, I went to work for EnviroGas, which had been up to that point my best client. The president of EnviroGas was another classmate of ours for law school.
What was his name?
John Clary.
Okay.
And I had started pretty much when they had started doing title work for them. And then I won't mention which attorney it was, but another local or area attorney offered to do what I was doing for half the price I was doing it for, and also had some connections to some leases they wanted. So I, for a while, didn't do that until they went for their big mortgage financing for the first time, and the bank said, "Oh, oil and gas title opinions, we'll only take Alan Laurita's." So they had to come back, and I got to redo everything that had been done. Yeah, I worked from '74 to through the end of '81, and then went to work for, actually, my deal with EnviroGas when I started was that I could maintain my practice part-time, and they hired my secretary to go from my law firm, and I could use her for that, and just as long as I was able to do legal work for them. And that lasted all of 2 months. After 2 months, EnviroGas was funny. It was primarily two brothers who owned it. John, who was the president and who worked in the Buffalo office, and he had several vice presidents helping him. And Bill, who ran all the field operations and the land operations, who had nobody helping him. And they'd been looking for some time, and Bill didn't like me initially, had been opposed to my being hired, but after 2 months we kind of hit it off, and they asked me to become an officer of a company and not practice law on the side, but work full-time in the oil and gas business. And when they got to the sentence of, "Oh yeah, we'll double your salary," I said yes.
Good. And as I recall, Mayville got transformed. Not only did you change your position as now in-house counsel, but seemingly every building had the same color, and you guys owned just about everything.
We owned quite a few buildings, 3 or 4, and had quite a huge operation. EnviroGas eventually had over 300 employees. Oh, wow. Not all in Mayville, but most working out of Mayville, and had operations in different states as well. But the main activity was out of Mayville, and it was a very exciting era. It didn't last for a real long time because a lot of things changed in the oil and gas industry, but when it was going, it was a lot of fun. When I first went back into the practice of law, it was selling the EnviroGas corporate office building to Harris Beach, and I used to kid the folks I worked with there that it was different. If I came to work now, I would drive. Back when I worked for EnviroGas, I wasn't allowed to drive there. If I had to go up to the corporate office building, I had a helicopter. And we had quite a fleet of them. It was kind of a fun era.
And what was it that, EnviroGas, I know they accumulated quite a few of leaseholds. Were they the developer? How did they work? What was their operation?
Well, they had relationships with a network of broker-dealers, and they would raise investment money to drill. And they were basically the driller-operator. They would acquire leases, and then we'd drill wells and operate the wells. And when I first joined them, when I first made the switch to work there, we had 7 drilling rigs full-time, which was truthfully an astronomical number. And so we were it took about a week to drill a well, And so we were drilling 7 wells a week, and it was pretty exciting. Then when the tax laws changed and there was a requirement that you had to actually spend the money that the investors paid you within a certain amount of time if they were going to get the write-off, we got up to 20 drilling rigs throughout the country. It was a very hectic time period, but it was fun.
You know, it's funny you brought up something like that. We did a lot of work here for Bounty Oil, you know,
Sure.
and I'm sure they work with you guys, but I forgot completely about the concept of year-end spending, and it got really crazy.
But it would, because you had to pay the money off over to the developer or the driller by year end, and you had to start a well within 90 days after year end. So it was hectic.
Yeah. Find a lease, find any place, please.
Yeah, get it permitted, which was not always easy, and you know, get the drilling rig started.
And were they sold out ultimately? Was that market-driven decision by your boys, or did they just feel it was the time?
Well, they didn't really sell out. What happened is the oil and gas industry got very difficult. We had the Natural Gas Policy Act, where the government controlled what price gas was sold for. And it turned out changed to a free market system, and the price went from roughly $5.50 per 1,000 cubic feet to under $3 per 1,000 cubic feet. The economics didn't work anymore. The people who had sold most of the investments realized they couldn't make the type of living they had made selling investments anymore. So they formed an oil and gas company and tried to take over operation of the wells. And that led to a lot of litigation between them and EnviroGas. Ultimately, neither company won, and the interests that were involved, the wells that were involved, were sold out to a company called Transfuel, which was a subsidiary of Mitsubishi. And there were really, I have lots of stories about that. One that you might get a kick out of, wire transfers were not too common prior to that. But for that transaction, everything was being done by wire transfer. And we had a lot of debt. It was no longer this original oil and gas company that had started the dispute, which was Walker Energy. They went under, it was a company called Texas Meridian, but in fact, they were the ones who found Transfuel as the buyer. But we both had a lot of debts we had to pay off as part of a closing. Everything was set with a fixed dollar amount because we were getting discounts, had to be paid that day. Well, we're still fighting on the day of a closing about some of the terms. In fact, I can remember being on the phone with Joe Zdarsky, who was representing them, yelling at him and cursing at him as the board of Mitsubishi came through and being introduced to him and bowing to him very courteously as I'm cursing at their attorney, and hoping they didn't speak English. But it didn't look like we were going to make it by the time wires were going to start. John Clary, who and I had gone down to close it, John left. He said, "This deal's done. I'm flying back. You can stay if you want and try and make it work." And so we finally all pile into a conference room, and a couple of us say, you know, we want this deal to work. We've worked out our differences, but we don't see how it can with the timing. And all of a sudden, this little Japanese man at the end of the table stands up. "It's not a problem. We own the bank." And Mitsubishi they own the bank. We got it done.
Oh, isn't that a great story?
Yeah, so that was fun.
Yeah, that is worth telling. So as you're saying, in one sense, you're in-house counsel, and you're selling not only your business, but your current career.
Yeah.
I mean, it's gone now, and you have to kind of wake up the next morning and saying, I've just signed off on behalf of my bosses. The deal is closed. Where do I go?
Yeah, we actually kept some wells and we stayed in business for a couple more years, but it sure dwindled down. And ultimately, what was the end was when we sold the corporate office building to Harris Beach. And part of the deal with in Buffalo, in Hamburg actually. In fact, if you got it, I mean, I'll tell you a funny story about that building. When it first got built, they put a workout facility in there and a racquetball court, and hired a young girl who had just graduated from Penn State to be kind of to run it. And like most of us when we graduate school, we're real proud of our first job, and she invited her dad to come see what she was doing, and he brought a couple of guys he worked with, and they go through it and what she has there, and he had done, and her dad's looking awful sad, and his friends are looking awful sad. She goes, "What's the matter, Dad?" She said, "Well, this is nicer than what we have." That was Chuck Knox, the coach of the Bills.
No kidding. No kidding.
Yeah, that was kind of how the Clarys did things, particularly John. It was high end all the way.
So that was certainly their reputation. As part of the oil and gas business at the time, one of the attorneys that, at least my memory is, in Buffalo, who did some oil and gas stuff was Dan Dara. Was he part of your world?
Dan was very much part of our world. Dan worked for Hodgson Russ, which was our law firm, left Hodgson Russ for a while and went to work for EnviroGas. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, we had Dan didn't stay long, but he worked for us for a short while. And Dan was one of the best litigators I've ever worked with, and it was good because I make a good second chair, and Dan did some litigation for EnviroGas, and we worked together on stuff, and he was really good. In fact, it was almost like Buffalo Bills alumni because we had Dan and we had Ed Rutkowski working for us at the time, after he was county executive in Erie County. So, but yeah, Dan was very good. Then Dan has bounced around, and now he's, I'm not sure if he's still practicing, but he went back to Pittsburgh where he had gone to law school and worked there for a while.
Just before I could forget, where's Jim these days?
Jim is retired. Jim is living in he and his wife are thinking of relocating, but they're in South Carolina. He retired this past summer from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Pardon me. But he did, he went into government service as a U.S. attorney and was there for quite a while, and now he's retired.
Is that where you went from here?
Yes. Yeah. And I'm not sure, he went, the Erie office of the U.S. Attorney's Office for Erie, Pennsylvania, which is where he met his current wife, and he got transferred to South Carolina. Basically did legal writing for them and wrote trial manuals and things like that, and we enjoyed it. And we had lost track of one another for a while, but our daughters had been born while we were practicing together 2 weeks apart, and stayed in touch. And they actually figured out when the two of us were going to be in Hilton Head at the same time. And they arranged for us to get back together, and we reunited, and I was there because I had a timeshare, and Jim and his wife bought a timeshare right next to us so we could see each other once a year.
Oh, how cool is that?
It's great. So we get, every April we get together.
Well, that's terrific. You may not have a memory of Cindy or I, but please extend our best.
I will. Actually, I remember you and Cindy because you're a year or two younger than we are, when you were first starting out. And
we're still at it. You mentioned Ernie Cowan.
Yeah.
Now, Sea Lion, and my only real story is that we were one of the first to actually, my parents and a family reunion went out on the Sea Lion on an actual cruise itself with group, and it sailed and it got videotaped by one of the channel crews. And
Right.
we're out there sailing it. So that's my image of it. But talk to me about Ernie Cowan, the Sea Lion project. You were obviously involved at the beginning.
Yeah, well, I did the incorporation, and it, wrote up their initial bylaws, and then that's when I was still practicing with DeMambro, Donovan, and Laurita. Ernie had this concept where he was going to build a 15th century sailing ship, merchant ship, but did have cannon, and using tools from that period, no modern tools. One of the people who was involved from the outset in the project was Paul Stage, who currently Chautauqua Bell. And it was through my relationship with Paul, I think, that Ernie came to me to form it. And it was a great project. What I had designed was a system where Ernie and the original people would, for a long, long time, be in charge of it. And unfortunately, that got changed later. When I went to work for EnviroGas, I kind of lost track of it for a long time. But unfortunately, control of the organization went away. The ship went away to Buffalo, sank. Came back. It's now down in Virginia.
So it is.
Yeah, in a historical park in Virginia, and it was donated, by the Sea Lion Project Ltd., which is still in existence, and now operates the Bemis Point Stowe Ferry. That's the only vessel they have left. They had the Chautauqua Bell for a while, which actually Jim Donovan did the legal work on when it was first built.
Okay.
Yeah, a guy named Jim Webster built it, and it was, and Jim was working on that when I first moved here, and they're still functioning. It's a shame we lost it because it was a great concept. It didn't work out as well as it could have, but it was a. I remember my parents had open heart surgery a week apart down in Tampa, Florida, and I went down, of course, to be there for part of it. And the nurse found out where I was from, and she just wanted to talk about the Sea Lion, really? Because she knew about it. Yeah. And I thought it was the greatest thing, which made my brother very jealous because I was married and just talking to her. He was single and she was really pretty.
Did you talk to Ernie afterwards? Was he an embittered guy through it all?
I didn't. I was not close with Ernie. I mean, I did the formation. I don't know that Ernie had a close relationship with any attorneys. Certainly we got along. As I mentioned, I had done my one criminal trial where Ernie had been the investigating, officer who pressed charges, and my client was acquitted. So I don't know that he had fond memories of that, but he, so I really don't know how he felt about it afterward.
So, timeline, now we are drawing closure to EnviroGas. You sold the building. Now, are you looking for your next option?
Part of our deal when we sold the building was John Clary and I got to keep offices in the building, okay, rent-free. And we looked at a couple of business ventures together. We were involved in a couple of restaurants, a couple other things. We did some oil and gas work for the law firm, They had a couple of Harris Beach. They had a fairly complex real estate transaction they were working on that they actually needed help with. They asked me to do it. And I did some other things for them. And ultimately, the guy who was their primary title attorney left to go elsewhere. And they asked me to fill that niche. So I just transitioned into working for Harris Beach for a long time, primarily doing real estate title insurance work, and picked up some oil and gas work along the way, and you know, that kind of blossomed again, different companies, but that, like you say, started to build back up a little bit, and stayed with Harris Beach for till, let's see, 2011. And then I moved to Hudson Russ, which one of my clients tells me that she and her husband were responsible for that, because Hudson Russ was trying to get their business, and she says, we told them that the only way they'd get any of our business is if they hired you away. But actually, the guy who was the chairman of the board of directors of Hudson at the time was another law school classmate and close friend. And he'd been pursuing my joining them for some time, and it just worked out.
Perfect. So, but you are living in Bemis Point, New York, and up until COVID time, probably commuting most of your days.
Every day.
Yeah.
Up until COVID time. And yeah, I moved down here in '74. Worked even through the early years with Envirogas. Eventually, Envirogas, I had to go up to Buffalo, but I commuted. I had gotten remarried, and my then wife and I had a son who, when we got divorced, he was 2, and he was going to school down here, and she lived down here, and so I was going to have a relationship with him, so I never moved. And, you know, it's turned out well that way. But it was worth the drive back and forth just to have a family. And, you know, this has become home.
Sure.
Not a native. I'm still mindful of that fact. I think there's a difference here if you are born and bred here, or if you are an import, but you know, this is home, this is where I live, where my friends are, all that stuff. So it was worth commuting.
As an instructional thing, part of what these videos have been, you've been in the practice for over 40 years. I know that because I am. And being not a native, you bring up a good point, but several of our younger lawyers are also not natives and they come here. What instruction might you give them?
I would give them the same instruction I give to younger attorneys in our firm in terms of dealing with our staff. And that is, treat people as you would like to be treated. If you're going to do work for a client, do it the same way that you would like an attorney to do it for you. It goes back to when I said we were building up a real estate practice. If there's an expectation that you're going to close on a certain day, do what you can to meet that expectation. The other piece of advice would be, if you've got a client that you're doing work for, and it's a business or something like that, try and learn something about the business. It's invaluable. And it's always try and be available. When you're dealing, particularly in business transactions, try and understand that while you're doing your best to represent your client and their interests, the other side isn't necessarily your enemy. and, you know, treat people respectfully, do a good job for them, and it pays off. But, I mean, if you got time for another story,
Sure,
I'll tell you, when I was with Harris Beach, I got, one of our attorneys got a file he wasn't sure how to handle, and it was a small, I say small, $1.5 million. It's a lot of money to me, but commercial transaction-wise, it was small transaction for a company which was the U.S. outlet of a company that was actually owned out of England. And I did it. They had California attorneys who really, for $1.5 million, certainly didn't come to the closing, didn't really do much. I wound up doing everything, and was dealing with their chief financial officer of the U.S. branch. And at the end of a transaction, he said, appreciate everything you did. And I said, well, if you ever need anything, give me a call. Oh, months later, I get a call from him, and it was right before Christmas. And he said, are you still interested and willing to do some stuff for us? And if we have a need for you? And I said, absolutely, happy to help you. And next day, I mean, like half hour before our office Christmas party, where we're going off to a chef's restaurant I get a call for him. I got something for you. I'd like you to look at this agreement. I'll fax it over to you. Don't spend more than a half hour on it. Just give me your quick thumbnail description, but I'd like you to represent us in this. I said, well, I can't do it. He says, I can't do it immediately. He says, well, can you get me something on it by the morning? I said, fine. I'm happy to do that, even though the next day is like a Saturday. So I have to wait as this little agreement, that's about an inch thick, comes over the fax machine. I take it home, don't look at it. Next morning, I get up and pour myself a cup of coffee and sit down, and it was I don't know, can you say, oh shit, on your recording? Look, they're buying Finesse and Aquanet hair care products worldwide. This is not a half-hour deal. But just by being nice to this guy, all of a sudden, I have that deal. And the next thing I know, this country bumpkin is in New York City, sitting, with a big international law firm negotiating on behalf of this little company to buy that, and almost got fired right away because I didn't yet own a cell phone, and the chief operating officer had come over from London, and couldn't understand why they would have an attorney that was like that. And at the end of the day, we hadn't quite finished, and the CFO said, well, I've got Alan a return flight. We don't need to keep him for tomorrow. And we got to look at something. He said, when he's been talking, the price has gone down by $30 million. Get him a room, get him a flight, and go buy him the biggest steak in town. Turned out to be a great relationship and a good client. And right after I moved to Hudson, they were sold, and I got to handle that closing. And it was 9 figures in pounds sterling, which is, at that time, 2.5 pounds sterling per dollar.
Great.
So it was very nice.
Good for you. Well,
and that's just from being nice to people.
Yeah.
And being available and being courteous. It wasn't trying to grab somebody else's client or being nasty. It was just, like I said, treating people like you'd like to be treated. That would be my biggest advice, and that's also my advice to attorneys I work with for how you get work done around the office.
So we talked last week, and you agreed to come in today, and in anticipation of that, did you wonder what question Greg may ask that he hasn't yet?
I didn't, but I assumed you would ask some history because you mentioned that in the call about coming in. But I really Didn't give a lot of thought. I did give me an opportunity to think. It made me smile about how Jim Donovan and I were reunited, and think back about some of the experiences and times I've had here, and certainly what I started out doing here in a small 3-person office, only 2 of whom were practicing attorneys. And where I am now with a firm that's over 200 attorneys is a lot different. It's a lot of smiles along the way. Lots of memories here. I mean, I could go across.
Sure, feel free.
Didn't know Jim Abdella real well. I talked to him quite a few times. I remember him running for Congress at one point. And he used to write an article for the Mayville Sentinel when that existed, before it was sold to the Post-Journal. So I had some interesting stories with him. His son, Steve, wasn't practicing when I was down here, so I really don't know him. Bob Alessi, had a few dealings with him. Remember when Paul Andrews was an investigator for the Public Defender's Office. We used to see him a lot because he worked with Jim, and then he became an attorney. Art Bailey, there's lots of stories about Art, and I have to tell you, my view of Art is different than a lot of people. I had quite a few dealings with him. He was always honest, and actually went out of his way to be fair on some things, which is not how a lot of other people looked at him. Mm-hmm. Mark Barger, I still see regularly. Good guy. And a good attorney. I send a lot of work to Mark when stuff that Hudson Russ doesn't do, but he can do locally. Real good guy. I probably ought to just skip over some of these. Remember Bill Banka we used to play racquetball together. And Darby Burgett was here for a long time. A little older than you and I, but not that much older, and a good attorney. Dealt with him. Sherry Cadwell, you probably know better than I, since that's who you started out with. A real gentleman. I mean, Sherry was, as far as I was concerned, the epitome of what a gentleman should be, and really liked him. Phil Calla, another good guy. Don't know him real well, but again, every time I've dealt with him, it's always been positive. Mm-hmm. Park Catchpole. The only story I remember about Park is he was in a golf tournament and got a hole-in-one and won a car. And he was debating whether or not to take it because he would then be a pro golfer and he couldn't play in golf tournaments anymore. And it wasn't much of a car, so I'm not sure. Judy Clare, I really didn't know that well. I know her husband, Howard Crossley, of course, I knew his son better than him, or his stepson. Wayne Harris, Mark Hampton, I think is actually a contemporary of ours. I think we started out pretty much the same. I think Mark and I think came here the same time. Always had good dealings with Mark. John Goodell was a legend in his own time. Al Ford was a great guy. He had been in partnership with Gene DeMambro, so he was years and years ago, and had maintained a good relationship with him. So got along real good with Al. I mean, didn't do a lot together, but he was good. Mike Goldman's another contemporary of. I think he started out the same time I did, got to know him a little bit through Raleigh Kidder because he had some political affiliations.
Married Stan Lundine's daughter.
Yes, he did. And Stan Lundeen had also been in partnership. I actually had worked for Gene DeMambro as a young attorney.
Really?
And so we saw Stan quite a bit at times. I didn't know Tom Flowers that well, but he's also from the same time era. Dick Fesenden's from the same time era. I forgot that Dick ever had dark hair. Warren Erickson was one of the two Ericksons, Phil being next to him. Warren was a great guy. Always enjoyed dealing with Warren. Phil was tough.
He was tough.
Bill Duncanson actually was older than us, but he started the same time I did. He had gone to law school later in life.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, I'll skip through some of these because a lot of Marty Idzik. I remember when Marty first came down here, and well, you would remember that again better than I. But another real gentleman, a great guy. Yeah, I'll skip. Stan Lundeen, of course, just mentioned. Joe Gerasi was county executive when I came down here.
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting guy. I mean, I never experienced it. I'm told he was a very good trial attorney. He was an excellent tennis player. I remember that.
Indeed.
He did, when I was married the last time, he did my now ex-wife a favor. She had been called as a juror and was picked and wasn't very popular. And as the attorneys agreed that she should be on the staff, he, so they could hear him, said that her husband was one of his favorite attorneys. Needless to say, she was excused right away. Lucian Ledestra, another guy whose reputation may never die. A guy who was a lion and a lamb at the same time. Mm-hmm. He could be very vocal and very tough, but he was a great guy. And I haven't talked to him. I don't even know. He may not even be alive anymore.
He passed away a few years ago.
But the last conversation I had with him, we were doing something, and in fact, it was property his son and Steve Cass owned, and we were doing an oil and gas lease, and we were talking. And he said, "You know, you and I can talk. We've known each other. Our relationship's always been honest. Neither one of us is going to lie, and we get a deal done." He said, "It doesn't seem like that anymore with the law." And he was feeling that the practice of law was changing. And I can't speak to that because I wasn't actively practicing down here anymore, but he missed that. John Palm and I did a big trial together. I was overage counsel for he was representing the insurance company, and it was involved a death. Tony Spann was the plaintiff's attorney. Joe Ricotta, who's I see on here, also was the judge. I think Tony and Joe were both expecting a huge verdict and came back 0. And it was really fun. And ironically, the defendant, who was the driver, our driver, and I now play golf in a golf league together. I see him once a week during the summer. Greg Peterson, I don't know if he ever going to turn out or not. Let's see. Lynn Hartley, nice guy. He was in private practice when I came here, then became judge. Lee Adams is a legend that should never die. One of the brightest men I've ever met. Just incredibly articulate, and somebody you definitely didn't want to get on the wrong side of, because he could be vicious if to those he didn't think were doing what they should be doing. Phil Cass, another great guy, very helpful to me, and always enjoyed dealing with him, and enjoyed dealing with his son, who's a friend. Joe Riccati, my first exposure to Joe was in law school. I took a trial technique course, and our final was to do a trial, and Joe was the judge. He fell asleep during the trial. And I still got a good grade in the course, but I think I did that to him. Yeah. The Price brothers, when I first decided to came, and I'm talking about Charles and Sam, not the next generation, decided to come down here, Raleigh Kidder found me a house, and Sam Price was representing the sellers, relatives, and he made it very, very clear. He was very unhappy that another attorney was moving to Chautauqua County. But after a bit of time, we got along just fine. When we did stuff together, and of course, their firm was always a high-end firm, very good. Sam Jr., another good guy, deal with him, and Tom did very well. Found a niche in real estate, and I think he's still doing pretty well.
Yep.
Wilson or Tripp was a real good guy. Unfortunately, we lost him very early on. Pat Rice, didn't really deal too much with Pat. He did have an office in Mayville, but I think that was after I was practicing there. Dale Robbins, didn't really deal with Dale too much. Neil Robinson was another contemporary, I think a year behind Jim Donovan and I. Saw a lot of Neil and did all stuff. John Samuelson, didn't know John real well, but he was another guy who graduated in same classes, law school class as Jim Donovan and I. Tubi Scarpino was a character.
Say the least.
Yeah, to say the least. Not. I opposed the fee he wanted once, and never liked me after that. He didn't get the fee either. Bruce Skolton, unfortunately passed away not too long ago. Decent guy, nice guy. John Sellstrom, the Swedish consulate.
Swedish consul. Yep.
Lanny Sheffield, one of the last people to clerk his way into a law license, and with his wife did a lot of stuff in that office.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she was good. Dick Slater was another. I think Dick was a year or so older than I am, but he was active in practice at the time. Rick Sotier was same as Mike Goldman and I. That's how I met him, the same as Mike Goldman, same era. Doug Spoto, he looks like a kid in this, but he's, again, a little older. Doug got appointed a referee in one of the bigger victories I ever had in litigation. After I stopped doing work, during that hiatus for EnviroGas, there was a landowner group involved in oil and gas. In fact, the first landowners group around, called Landowners with Oil and Gas Interests and Concerns. And the county had adopted a system of taxing gas wells that had largely been pushed and created by the oil and gas companies, and this group wanted to oppose it. And they wound up hiring me, and we brought a case in Supreme Court, and they appointed Doug as the referee to hear the trial. And we were suing 3 municipalities, I think. And, so there were 3 experienced attorneys on the other side, and I was still pretty green behind the ears. And I remember going to the trial and thinking, this is uncomfortable, I'm nervous, 3 older guys who know what they're doing against me, I'm still new, and I get there and there's literally a couple hundred people at the trial.
Wow.
And then I realized they're all
Well, your people.
my people. And we managed to get the system of taxation thrown out. And of course the municipalities appealed, and it's one of the few times the appellate division has charged costs against municipalities. We won unanimously on appeal. And ironically, after that, I went to work for Envirogas and sat on a committee that the state formed to redo oil and gas taxation. And landowners who have royalty interests in gas wells are no longer taxed for them.
Yeah.
It's treated as an operating expense. Jim Subject used to work for us, a great guy. Bob Van Every, who I dealt with quite a bit. As I said, I didn't know Judy Clare that well, but who is Bob's wife, obviously, or at least was. Stan Weeks was a real fine gentleman. Jim Westman, who worked for us, his mother was Stan's secretary.
Mae Westman.
Westman, yeah. Ward Westerberg, another good guy. Jim Westman just mentioned. Clive Wright. The Wrights were, all of them were just great people. And, Greg Yaw, Greg, I think, just recently retired.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe smarter than us.
Well, many of those guys that you've talked about who are of our age have been where you are, talking their war stories. So this has been perfect.
Yeah, a lot of really good people here.
Well, you're good people, and I'm delighted you came, Alan.
Well, thank you for inviting me.